Welcome to NT Podcast, where science, theology, and history come together in thoughtful dialogue. I'm your host, Nemanja Jurišić, and today we are diving into one of the most discussed and debated books in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Isaiah. Our guest is Dr. Megan Roberts, Old Testament scholar, so welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Thank you for coming and taking your time to participate in this interview. And for the beginning, I just want to send greetings for our friend Dr. Goran Živković. So he studied with you at McMaster. So he said that he will watch this when it is published. So yeah. So just for those who don't know you, maybe Dr. Megan Roberts earned her Ph.D. in Christian Theology, focusing on the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament from McMaster Divinity College. She also holds MA in Biblical Exegesis with honors from Wheaton College and BA in Applied Linguistics, graduating with highest honors from Moody Bible Institute. And also, Dr. Roberts currently teaches Old Testament and serves as the program director for Bible and Theology at Prairie. Am I correctly saying?
Prairie College.
Oh yeah, okay, Prairie College. So you also your PhD is supervised by two highly respected scholars in the field, Dr. Mark Boda and Paul Evans. So would you like to add something about that?
Yeah, I never expected to do a PhD, and so I didn't really make a point in my undergrad or master's degree to form relationships within the academic world beyond my own professors. So actually, when I came to apply for PhD programs, um, oddly enough, I had never heard of either Mark Boda or Paul Evans. Uh, and I ended up emailing Mark first because his area of study was more aligned with what I was hoping to study. And then I ended up obviously going to McMaster. And when I got there and met Mark and started taking classes with him and Paul as well, I was rather shocked that in my years of study I hadn't ever come across either of their names, especially Mark's. Um, and that was just a profound gift. I had no idea that I was striking gold when I asked Mark Boda to be my doctoral supervisor. Um, yeah, it was quite a remarkable privilege. He's one of the most remarkable people I've ever been privileged to know. Yeah.
Yes, in my mind, definitely top scholar of 21st century. So amazing.
Mhm.
So yeah, today we will explore critical questions that have intrigued scholars and theologians alike, such as who wrote the book of Isaiah, how it was transmitted, and what we can learn from its composition through linguistic and theological shifts. But other things also. So my first question is, what led you to focus on your research specifically on Isaiah 40 to 55, a section you published extensively on?
Yeah, well, I haven't yet published extensively, though my dissertation is coming out hopefully in a couple of months. I've done a lot of presentations on this section. Um, Before I did my PhD, in between my master's degree and my PhD, I taught in Cambodia for 5 years, middle high school and Bible and high school choir at Logos International School in Phnom Penh. And with that teaching, I was able to teach the entire Bible multiple times to my middle and high school students. And that was a real gift to me because it helped me to better grasp the overarching connectedness of the Testaments and the thematic and narrative and theological threads that hold the Testaments together. And I started to see all kinds of threads from the Old Testament that converged in the New Testament. And some of those threads that I became very curious about that converged in the person of Christ in the Gospels is the idea of Sabbath and Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath, and then the writer of Hebrews using Sabbath rest as his primary metaphor for salvation, or a dominant metaphor for salvation. And then um, the idea at the Last Supper of I'm establishing a new covenant. Do this, whenever you do this in memory or remembrance of me. So there was this convergence of Sabbath rest, which in the Old Testament word and concept of shalom, this holistic well-being and memory, and they are these threads in the Old Testament that then cross paths and converge in the person of Christ. And that really intrigued me, this whole idea of well-being, Sabbath rest connected to memory and remembering, correct remembering. So when I came to do my PhD and I thought about what I was intrigued by, I was very much intrigued by this whole I wanted to know what the Old Testament background was for these ideas. So originally, actually, I wanted to kind of do some kind of dialogue between Deuteronomy and Isaiah. And of course, in that exploration, I discovered that, there's this concentration of memory language in Isaiah 40 to 55. And I came across, of course, Isaiah 43 and Isaiah 46 that have these opposite memory commands. Isaiah 43 says, do not remember the former things. And then just a few chapters later in 46, it says, remember the former things. And so I was very interested in sort of this connection between Deuteronomy and Isaiah. And then I very quickly realized that that was way too big of a topic to cover. And that was way too much text to try to chew on in a dissertation. So I realized that more work had been done in Deuteronomy around memory and its memory commands and warnings of not to not forget and forsake Yahweh. And it just felt more accessible to me. And what really felt inaccessible was Isaiah and prophetic poetry and what was going on with this prophetic poetry. So I chose to do the thing that I felt less equipped for because I thought, well, now is my time. Now is my opportunity to do the thing that I know the least about.
Wonderful. I listened recently David Carr about the exile period and memory studies. So, do you have anything to add about that topic? Because he comments something about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so originally when I set out to figure out what was going on with all of the memory language in Isaiah 40 to 55, you quickly realize that everybody recognizes that those chapters are saturated with memory, not just memory language, but also use of traditions and creative combination of traditions and intertextuality and using language from other texts and seemingly responding to other texts, in particular responding to Lamentations. And and yet, no one had ever addressed memory as a phenomenon specifically. So I first tried to get at memory itself just by doing very, very careful exegesis and linguistic analysis. But that really didn't lead me anywhere. I didn't get any farther than anybody else had gotten. And so that's when I realized that I needed some kind of different framework that was going to help me actually understand the phenomenon of memory itself. So then that's what sort of propelled me, as well as a class with Mark Boda on exile and restoration. And in that class, he forced us. None of us really wanted to. He forced us to get into sociological method and sociological theory. And all of us felt very overwhelmed by that, thinking, we're we're Old Testament people. We're not sociologists. How can we do a good job with this? But I'm so thankful for that class because it pushed me into taking the plunge of getting into the world of memory studies, in particular sociological memory studies. And that from my perspective, I like my own research. I'm convinced by my own research. Uh, that was the framework and that was the methodological model that I needed to understand collective memory in a trauma, post-trauma context. Um, so and more of this is being done. So I definitely I interacted some with David Carr's work in my dissertation, but I do think that memory studies, sociological memory studies, in conjunction with um, studies on forced migration, refugee studies, trauma theory, it's very illuminating for texts like Isaiah 40 to 55.
Amazing. So, can you give some examples how trauma affects authors and public or readers? Because Isaiah 40 to 55 is connected to exile period or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think a first place to start is the fact that as a literary section, Isaiah 40 to 55 begins with that pronouncement of comfort that most people are so familiar with. Comfort, comfort, my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Tell her that her hard service is over, that her debt has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all of her sins. And then, of course, that idea and that theme of comfort and compassion is a dominant thematic thread through those chapters. And the question is, well, why? And the obvious reason is because the exile was massively traumatic on every level. So, not just the war trauma, the siege warfare of Jerusalem, the desolation of the land and the towns and the cities around Jerusalem, of course, not just the forced migration of taking groups of Judeans back to the land of Judah, but also the theological trauma. The Judeans were completely overwhelmed by the fact that Yahweh hadn't protected his city and his temple. He had done it during Hezekiah's time, miraculous rescue from the Assyrians who were also getting ready to lay siege to Jerusalem. Why didn't he do it again? And of course, we have ample evidence in Isaiah 1 to 39, in the book of Jeremiah, in the book of Ezekiel. We have ample evidence. The prophets told the people why, but of course they weren't listening. And it didn't register in their minds that it was their own idolatry. It was their own rejection of Yahweh that was bringing on them this just discipline. But of course, from their perspective, they interpreted the exile, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple as Yahweh being powerless or not caring, that Marduk and the Babylonians really were stronger than him, and he really couldn't follow through on his promises to be the only God. And so the obvious explanation for the ancient Judeans was that Yahweh had abandoned them. He was not who he said he was. And he was a big fat liar. And so this theological shattering of all of the covenant promises, the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, this level of trauma, of just this overwhelming shattering of identity and sense of an ability to tell a coherent narrative. I would argue this is why the theme of comfort is so desperately necessary. But of course, in the context of trauma, especially when the people are accusing Yahweh of being the source of all of their problems, to receive comfort requires that you trust the person trying to give it to you, but they don't trust Yahweh at all. They think that he has maliciously and intentionally been the source of all of their shattering. And so you can see it in the text, in the way in which the back and forth, we really only hear Yahweh and the prophet's voice. Every once in a while, we hear the people's voice in various shades. But there is this kind of implied dialogue in Isaiah 40 to 55, where in between the poetic units, the implication is that the people have responded to Yahweh, often negatively, so that then the poetry then provides Yahweh's response to their implied negative response. And they do not trust Yahweh, and so he is doing everything in his power, not just to change their rational conceptions. I think this is one of the great value points of memory studies, is that memory studies recognizes that memory is not even primarily rational, but is rather primarily emotional, relational, and embodied. And so I talk about memory framework formation in my dissertation, because a memory framework or a memory schema is the interpretive framework through which we understand our present in light of our past in order to understand a potential future. And this whole interpretive schema is deeply emotional and relational. The rational is involved, but like I said, memory is not primarily rational, although it's all three together: emotional, relational, rational, also embodied. And so if Yahweh wants to shift the memory framework of the exilic Judeans, who have been completely traumatized on every level, then he has to engage the emotional, relational dynamics. And of course, the rational is involved. There is argument. There's even invitation. Come, bring me your best arguments. Let's work this out. You think that you have a better argument than I have for the best interpretation of the exile event and what has happened here and my identity and your identity? Okay, let me hear it. So there is argumentation, but I would argue that the poetry's most significant intent and the poetry's most significant goal is to engage the emotional, relational dynamics and to reestablish trust. And there's other ways in the poetry that you see sort of aspects of trauma. So, for example, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we get descriptions of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But in Isaiah, we don't. It's all just assumed. And I can't prove this, but one of my suggestions is that the reason that the exile events themselves, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the forced migration of the people, is not described is because trauma really is, it goes beyond what can be verbalized. And actually, sometimes you need to verbalize it in the healing process, but other times, verbalizing the details of the trauma actually becomes even more traumatizing. But there's ways in which, so the poetry fully acknowledges the extent of the pain and the confusion and the shattering and the suffering. And yet there's even points in the poetry where those descriptions break off in incomplete thoughts. It's described, but there's again these times when the syntax is disjointed and it's incomplete. And it gives you this sense that you can try to describe the suffering, but words ultimately fail. And so I think that's again one of the reasons why why is this text written in poetry? Why is so much of the prophetic material written in poetry? Because poetry can say more through the images, through the metaphors, through the combinations of images and metaphors. Poetry captures emotion and the relational dynamics in a way that other forms of genres don't have the ability to capture. So that was a really long, rambling answer. But I think hopefully that gets at your question of how do we see the trauma in the text?
Wow, I'm amazed. I really want to talk about this more, but let's just briefly touch our topic because we can get back to this later. Yeah, so can you say something about who wrote the book of Isaiah? Because we have that division. You're talking about exile, but
Mhm.
traditionally Isaiah wrote. So what do you think about all this?
Okay, so the question of authorship for Isaiah is a sticky one. Um, it's been thought about and discussed, as you noted in your question to me about the Talmudic perspective that maybe Hezekiah and his um, skilled, scribes, maybe they were the ones who ultimately wrote down Isaiah's prophecies and compiled them. And uh, so I guess the short answer to your question from my perspective is that the book of Isaiah, as we now have it in its final form, does stem from multiple authors. How many? I really don't know. uh, the longer answer for me sort of goes along the lines of recognizing that how the prophetic books came to be in their final written form is something of a mystery, but we know enough and we can hypothesize enough to know that it had to have been a rather complicated process. So, in general, prophetic messages were delivered orally, just spoken orally. Now, of course, in Jeremiah, we do get specific description of the fact that sometimes when Jeremiah received a prophetic message from God, his scribe, Baruch, would actually write it down right then and there, and that Jeremiah would then both deliver it orally, but it would also be written. But it seems as though for the majority of other prophets, they start from these oral messages. Perhaps, maybe probably, they were delivered multiple times to multiple groups of people. Eventually, they had to be written down. Who did this? Well, we don't really know. Perhaps the prophet did some of it, uh, but perhaps other people who were associated with the prophet also wrote it down. And I think it's important to note that most of our prophetic material is written in third person about the prophet. Now, sometimes we get the first person voice, which indicates that maybe the prophet was somewhat involved in actually writing stuff down. But of course, the majority of what we have is third person about the prophet, which just on face value then indicates that somebody else wrote it. And if we're thinking about the writing materials that were available, we recognize that the easiest writing material would have been clay tablets. Um, Not papyrus, not parchment. Of course, again, we get with Baruch this idea that Baruch is writing on a scroll. Um, but in any case, we're probably looking at the fact that once the prophet's messages were actually written down, they were almost certainly first written down on individual clay tablets. So then the next step, of course, is that then you have a community of people who affirm that this prophet is from Yahweh, a true prophet from Yahweh, and therefore their word is authoritative, and their word should then be preserved. And then somehow it comes where those clay tablets are collected, and then actually they're put into a particular order and written down on scrolls in a more sort of fixed order that then, gets passed down. So, the way in which we actually get our prophetic books as final form text is quite a complicated process from what we can know about the ancient world. And so regardless of whether or not you think that the whole book of Isaiah came from Isaiah from the 8th century, or you affirm multiple prophetic figures involved, either way, multiple people had to be involved in actually getting the text into its final form, in my perspective. There's also very, very interesting phenomenon with the book of Isaiah that chapters 1 to 39 are sort of what we might, for lack of a better word, what I might call more stereotypical prophetic oracles, where you have these distinguishable prophetic oracles. You have the oracles against the nations or concerning the nations, a judgment oracle, a salvation oracle, a restoration oracle, woe oracles, songs of praise. You have, and these are all more sort of stereotypical, identifiable prophetic forms. And you can tell that they, even as you read them, they sound more oral. You can imagine them being pronounced, even though it's poetry, which I, don't know that perhaps Isaiah and the prophets were skilled enough that they actually pronounced their prophetic messages in very poetic, skilled form. But what's interesting about Isaiah 40 to 55, even in contrast to 56 to 66, is that you don't have these really clearly distinguishable prophetic forms anymore. And it's not my area of expertise in any way, shape, or form, but there is an argument from Isaiah scholars that actually Isaiah 40 to 55 presents itself much more as a written composition rather than originating in oral prophetic messages. And so you have these indicators in the text that multiple things are going on, that it doesn't all sound like or read like a single author. Now, in your interview with Dr. Oswald, he proposes the idea that, and he also recognizes that multiple hands were probably involved in actually bringing it to its final form. And he would like to suggest that it is the product of a single mind, the mind of Isaiah of the 8th century. And, I'm not sure that I would disagree, even as I would argue that the text comes from multiple prophetic persons with multiple hands involved, because I do think that there is a remarkable kind of literary unity, so that Isaiah, the prophet of the 8th century, is definitely the authoritative perspective that the later prophets are functioning under. But I think that there's enough differences across the sections that, including just the fact that it's much, in my perspective, it makes much more sense to read Isaiah 40 to 55 in the context of the exile. Again, I think this comes back to the idea of really asking the question of what are the prophetic messages supposed to do? And while I fully affirm the reality and the validity of predictive prophecy, I think that at least in certain Western pockets of scholarship and Christianity, the idea of predictive prophecy has become so important because, of course, it was attacked by secular scholarship. And so I think there was a kind of reaction to say, no, this is a predictive prophecy. It did stem from an earlier time. The prophets were foretelling what would come in the future, not just their own sort of immediate future, but also predicting Jesus. And I think that uh, the desire to defend predictive prophecy has actually become far outsized in terms of what the prophetic texts were actually intended to do in their own time and place, and what the prophetic texts are intended to still do for the church today. And so I would fully affirm the reality of predictive prophecy, absolutely. And yet I would want to take a step back and say, but is that really the primary goal of these prophetic texts for their own original audience or for us? I don't think so. I think the primary goal is formation and transformation of the original audience as well as us. And of course, that includes discussions of the future. It even includes predictions of the future. Um, but all of that is done in such a way as to motivate a certain kind of formation and relationship with God in the present.
Thank you very much. Can you comment then prophecy about servant from Isaiah 53? Is that connected to their audience more than with Jesus, maybe?
The short answer is yes. Um, yeah. So when I teach Isaiah to my students here, I I tell them, okay, trust me, I'm not a heretic, but you're not allowed to think about Jesus right now. Um, and I work really hard to um, to take my students back to the original world of the prophetic text. Because of course, ultimately, as Jesus himself affirms, all of the law and the prophets and the Psalms point to him of like yes and amen. But my question is, and my pushback is, but how? So many times we just assume that Jesus is telling us to then go back to the Old Testament and look for all of the predictions. And what I want to argue for is that all of the Old Testament points to Christ because the Old Testament provides us with the paradigms of reality that correctly interpret the identity and the character of God and that correctly interpret his work in human community through the progression of history as he progressively reveals himself, so that with these true paradigms for interpretation, we get to Jesus and we say, oh my gosh, we get it. So, with the servant figure in Isaiah 40 to 55, I would strongly argue that Isaiah 49, 50, well, 42, 49, 50, and 52, 53 are not predictive prophecies. And I really, I really wish that actually Isaiah scholarship could let go of the term servant songs because they really, in my perspective, do violence to the poetic whole of Isaiah 40 to 55. Because this is high level poetry, and poetry functions on multiple layers of meaning, and it functions on metaphor and image and poetic figures that do lots of things all at the same time. And so I would argue that we have to keep the Jacob Israel servant figure as a poetic figure in order to be hermeneutically and exegetically consistent with the text itself. Zion is a poetic figure. She does lots of different things in the text. Her children, less a poetic figure, more historical people, but very much a figure of the poetry. And so if we're going to follow the lead of the form, the genre of the text itself, that servant figure has to remain a poetic figure from beginning to end. And so I would argue I do argue in my dissertation that the servant figure, as you trace the servant figure through these chapters, is one of the poetic figures that Yahweh engages in order to bring about a memory framework transformation. And that the ideal of who the servant should be, the Jacob Israel servant should be, is talked about in Isaiah 42. Yahweh is describing for Jacob Israel servant who he should be. But then, of course, all the rest of the poetry up through chapter 48 affirms who the Jacob Israel servant figure is not in his rebellious idolatry and misinterpretation of the exile and Yahweh's character and Yahweh's identity and his own identity. And then when we get to chapter 49, we hear a first person speaking voice who self-identifies as servant Israel. But now the poetry is giving us a model of what it would look like if the servant figure actually accepted the memory framework formation that Yahweh is attempting to accomplish for the Jacob Israel servant figure, what it would actually look like. What would the Jacob Israel servant say and do? How would he act? How would he interpret his exilic suffering if he underwent this memory framework transformation? And that's what I would argue the poetry is doing. It's giving us a poetic figural example of how the people, the Jacob Israel servant figure, this complex audience, should actually come to interpret their own experience of the exile and exilic suffering. And if that transformation comes about, then there's a way in which the suffering, and of course, this is where poetry becomes slippery and polyvalent all at the same time. Because, of course, the text of Isaiah 40 to 55 has to deal with the question of innocent suffering. So, from especially an outside perspective, we get the argument of Jacob Israel's servant figure is an abject idolater. He's rebellious And he has brought on himself all of this suffering, and he doesn't get it, and he just needs to repent and get a grip on the fact that Yahweh wasn't being unjust. This was just discipline. So that aspect of the argument is really easy for us to grasp. The much more difficult question is, okay, sure, but what about innocent suffering? What about the faithful who never bowed the knee to an idol, who never rebelled against Yahweh, like Jeremiah and Baruch, and the people who supported Jeremiah and actually believed him? And yet they suffered all of the exilic shattering anyway. What does Yahweh have to say about that? This is a much more difficult question that the poetry has to engage. It has to address it if Yahweh wants to accomplish comforting his people. So the servant figure in the polyvalence of the ability for poetry to communicate multiple things at the same time addresses this question of innocent suffering, as does the Zion figure, but she forms another side of the innocent suffering question. And of course, the answer to innocent suffering is that Yahweh was there. They were not suffering alone. And innocent suffering in the hands of Yahweh actually accomplishes redemption for the many. So this is why then this text gets picked up by the New Testament writers. It's not predictive of Jesus. Yahweh was saying that this was already true of innocent sufferers in the exile. This was true of their innocent suffering, that it produced righteousness for many, right? That he is the God who brings life out of death, who redeems out of nothing. That's already true for the innocent sufferers of the exile. Then, of course, it's ultimately true when we get to Christ. But of course, Peter applies Isaiah 52:53 not only to Christ, but also to the church. The church who he's writing to, who are suffering persecution, and he's trying to encourage them. And so he reminds them that, yes, Christ is the epitome of the innocent sufferer, out of which God brings resurrection life, but that the church joins Christ in his innocent suffering to also be conduits of resurrection life. So I would argue then that this is a whole paradigm of how Yahweh works in innocent suffering. And that was true first of the exilic period for the innocent, faithful sufferers of the exilic period. And it becomes the epitome of truth in Christ, but not in a predictive way.
Mind-blowing. Thank you so much, Professor Roberts. So this works like analogy or typology, not as a prediction. Is it written in past tense, just to ask?
Isaiah 52:53 is one of the most difficult sections of poetry to translate. It has some of the most textual variants. The voicing is very difficult. Who's talking? Who are they talking to? When does a voice switch to another voice? And similarly, partially because Hebrew verbs function slightly differently in Hebrew poetry, it's not easy to tell. Parts of the poem speak in past tense as though it is recounting part of a kind of story. It's not really a story, but recounting how the one who is despised and rejected how he grew up, right? What he experienced in the past. And so there's a kind of way in which the poetry actually moves from past to present, also to future. So it's not consistent. There's not a single time reference in the poem. So it's very difficult to actually pin pin the poem down. It's very difficult.
Right. I loved those easy questions. So yeah. Okay. So do you see some division between those parts, Isaiah 1 to 39, so 40 to 55, and then the rest? Because some would say that the last part is true to Isaiah, like post-exilic. So do you see some differences? And can you tell us something about dating those materials? Yeah.
All right. So possible dates for the various sections of Isaiah. Um, yeah, some scholars who would be sort of more, I don't want to call them extreme. Um, they would Some scholars would date the final form of the book to, very late post-exile, 400s, 300s. Um, I tend to sort of have a much tighter thought on that. So it does seem as though much of Isaiah 1 to 39 obviously does stem from the 8th century. Um, Interestingly, though, it also has indications that it was edited much later as well. So, for example, the oracles against the nations in chapters 13 to 23 begin with two oracles against Babylon, which, if we were still solidly in the Assyrian period in the 8th century, uh, you might expect to find oracles against Syria, sort of beginning that whole section. Um, but you don't. You have two very long oracles against Babylon, which, in my perspective, would lend itself to thinking about those being added later, in the exilic period, perhaps. Um, Again, Isaiah 40 to 55 seems to be from the exilic period. Of course, the poetry mentions Cyrus by name, and this, of course, is one of those pieces of the argument for those who really want to argue strongly for single authorship. I know Dr. Oswalt definitely talked about this in his interview, where from his perspective, the only way in which the mention of Cyrus in Isaiah 45 works for the argument of poetry is if it's far in advance, so that Yahweh's prediction of Cyrus by name um, happens well before, Cyrus was even a name that could be known as a ruler. Um, I do understand that perspective. Um, on the other side of it, my perspective is that, again, maybe that's making a little bit too much of the necessity of prediction like that. Um, and that if we situate the prophetic person or persons behind Isaiah 40 to 55 somewhere in the middle of the exile, maybe around 550 or so, when Cyrus was the ruler of the Medes and, doing his work to unite the Medes and the Persians. So he perhaps was known, but if Yahweh is saying at that point in time, yeah, that Cyrus on the other side of the mountains who's uniting the Medes and the Persians, yeah, I'm going to use him to take down the Babylonians. From my perspective, that actually still completely works in the argument of Yahweh's polemic against idols. And of course, the polemic against idols in terms of the idol's inability to predict the future is just one aspect of the way in which Yahweh critiques idolatry. Um, they can't predict the future. But much more so than not being able to predict the future, I would say that the weight of the argument against idols in Isaiah 40 to 55 is that they don't hear and they don't see and they don't listen and they can't do anything for the people who worship them. Whereas Yahweh, so you have these texts in Isaiah 40 to 55 where humans are just expending so much time and energy and expense to then set up this idol. And, out of half of the wood that they gathered, they made an idol, and the other half, the guy cooks a meal and eats it and warms himself. And and then the other thing of like, oh, this is a heavy burden to carry, and the humans have to carry it, and then they've got to set it up in a spot where it won't fall over. And so it's true, idols can't tell the future. But I don't actually think that that's the biggest part of the argument against idols. I think the biggest part of the argument is that your own hands made these, and they can't hear, they can't see, they can't speak, they can't do anything. In contrast, I, Yahweh, formed you, I carry you, I call you by name, I am going to accomplish this great redemption for you, right? So, um, so I do think that situating Isaiah 40 to 55 somewhere around 550-ish. And of course, this is where it gets a little tricky, right? Because situating the prophetic pronouncement of messages around 550 can be a different discussion than when was it written down? I don't know when it was written, but the poetry seems to indicate that perhaps the original setting for how to hear it is maybe around 550 or so. Then when we come to Isaiah 56 to 66, there's not a clear poetic break between 55, 56, 57. The poetry sounds quite similar among those three chapters. Um, and yet I do think that once you get to 56 to 66, you are clearly in a context where you're talking about people worshiping at the temple, bringing offerings and sacrifices, Sabbath observance, who's allowed into the temple courts or not? Are eunuchs allowed in or not? So you do get the sense then that the setting is perhaps the Second Temple, the early Second Temple period, when it is post-exile, perhaps around 500, 515, 500. But there is an argument to be made. Torsten Uhlig, who is professor in Germany, in his dissertation, he argued that actually 40 to 55 is exilic and the provenance is Babylon. And 56 to 66 is also exilic, but the provenance is the land of Judah. Um, I don't know the intricacies of that argument well. Um, I I tend to say, eh, sure, maybe. I don't know. But again, the indications that we get in the text, I would say lean me a little bit more towards sort of affirming 56 to 66 being Second Temple, but probably early Second Temple, perhaps. I don't know. And then perhaps they were the ones who put the book into its final form.
Yes, that's the answer from many great scholars. They always say, I don't know. So that's honest. So thank you. Um Yes, so I wanted to ask, is it possible maybe that there were some prophecies about Cyrus the Great and something like that, but let's say in 7th or 6th century before exile, but they are not written down. They are written down in the time of 550 or something like that. What do you think?
Mm. Um, I'm sure it is possible. Um, I held a single authorship for the book of Isaiah for quite a long time, actually until my PhD studies. And what changed my mind again brings me back around to what is the prophetic message supposed to do? And a prophetic message, from my perspective, needs to be meaningful if it's going to be remembered. It has to have some kind of meaning for the original audience if it's going to be recalled, written down, preserved, seen as authoritative in some way. So I can imagine a scenario in which Isaiah of the 8th century said to his Assyrian period audience, I'm going to look far beyond the Assyrians, even the Babylonians, even beyond them, because our God is the God who holds the scope of human history and his plan altogether. Sure, I can imagine that being the case. Um, but it had to be meaningful to an Assyrian period audience in some way. And in its form in Isaiah 40 to 55, I don't see that form being meaningful to an Assyrian period audience. I see it being meaningful to a Babylonian period audience.
Yes, it makes so much sense. So thank you very much. And you mentioned some variants about 52, 53 chapters. So did you study anything about that, about Qumran scrolls, LXX? So yeah, can you tell us something about variants?
Yeah, so I didn't do close work myself on Isaiah 52 to 53. Actually, my goal was to avoid it, if at all, if at all possible, because it's so difficult. Um, so because it was not a section of poetry that contains the memory language, I didn't do my own, careful translation work of it. But I did enough of it to say, oh my goodness, this is really overwhelming and a whole topic unto itself. Um, so, the variance in Isaiah 52 to 53, sort of in particular.
Sorry, can I just add? I didn't ask just about those chapters, but rather whole Isaiah. So can you say uh,
Sure.
generally, because people would say it's same in Qumran and Masoretic and yeah. So
Uh, yeah. Yeah, I grew up hearing that as well. We found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're exactly the same as the Hebrew manuscripts from the Middle Ages. Well, that's not actually true. Sorry to burst anyone's bubble, but it's not actually true. Very similar, remarkably similar, but not exactly the same. So, for 1Q Isaiah A, which maybe some of your listeners will know, the Great Isaiah Scroll. If you're interested in the Great Isaiah Scroll, you can look it up. You can see pictures of it online. It's amazing. Um, a single scroll of all 66 chapters with just small pieces missing because of, fragments of parchment broken away. But this is the Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isaiah A. Of course, there's other significant scroll fragments of the book of Isaiah from Qumran, 1Q Isaiah B, 1Q4C. Anyway, I get confused. But one of the things that is sort of characteristic of 1Q Isaiah A is that it will have more full spellings. So in Hebrew, there are no vowels, but some of the consonants like yod and vav can function as vowels or long vowels. And so um, in the orthography, in the spelling of 1Q Isaiah A, you will more often find a word spelled with more vavs and yods that are standing in for vowels. So this is just a spelling variation, it's not changing the meaning of the word. But of course, the tricky thing about Hebrew is that because it doesn't have vowels and words are then just based on groups of consonants, sometimes consonants can, a group of consonants can mean more than one thing. And sometimes, a yod will look like a dalet or a resh, and then you will actually get a different word. So there's these types of variants between the Qumran scrolls and, say, Leningradensis, which is our, sort of standard Hebrew Masoretic text that most people would use today as a starting point. So spelling differences, as well as some differences in, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's a third person verb versus, or a third person singular verb versus a third person plural, or so there are variants that will slightly change the reading of a given text. In Isaiah 52 to 53, for example, there's a variant where I think it's in 52:13, I think, when there's something about the text can either read, he will startle many nations, or he will sprinkle many nations. So startle versus sprinkle, both of them fit in the context. So yeah. Um, yeah, there you go. You just, you know. Um, Another interesting thing about Isaiah 40 to 55 in particular is that it has a lot of words that only occur once in the Hebrew Bible. Um, and so then you have, so then if you want to talk about the Septuagint a little bit, Septuagint Isaiah is not my area, and it's kind of a whole area of study unto itself because it's so complicated. It seems as though the translator for Septuagint Isaiah, um, well, they were also, whoever this person was, also didn't know what many of these hapax legomena words meant. And so you can tell that the Septuagint translator is doing the best that he can, thinking about intertexts that might help him understand the meaning of this particular word. Um, and so there's interesting, and it seems as though the Septuagint Isaiah translator was a little bit more free, not trying to stay rigidly word for word between the Greek and the Hebrew, but trying to capture metaphors and images and sort of the poetic feel with a little bit more freedom than some of the other Septuagint translators with their in relation to their Hebrew texts. An interesting difference in Isaiah 46 is in the Masoretic text as well as in 1Q Isaiah A. Verse 146, verse 1 talks about Bel and Nebo, two Babylonian deities, referring to Marduk and Nabu, his son. But in the Septuagint of Codex Sinaiticus, it changes it to Bel and Dagon, the Philistine deity of that you might remember from First Samuel. So that's a very interesting variant. Nabu would have been a well-known Babylonian deity. So why the Septuagint translator decided to do it Bel and Dagon rather than Bel and Nabu, I don't know. I will perhaps ask him when I get to the new creation. Um, yeah, so there are interesting variants like this, which, again, sort of makes Septuagint Isaiah sort of a whole area of research unto itself, because of the particular sort of flavor that the Septuagint translator, and sort of the method that the Septuagint translator used, that again, a little bit more free than some of the other Septuagint translations, but still very valuable. The Septuagint is still of Isaiah is still very valuable for trying to figure out what's going on in texts where the vocabulary is obscure. There are variants among the Hebrew manuscripts. Going to the Septuagint is very valuable to see how that translator read it.
Great, thank you so much. I think this is very important for our audience to know this. So, I wanted to ask about the theological differences between some parts of Isaiah. We have in 45:7 Isaiah that God is source of everything. Like He creates light and darkness, He creates peace and evil or misery, however to translate. So, in light of trauma and that experience of them. So, what do you think? What they believe that God maybe do everything, even evil things, or yeah, did they progress through time, or
Yeah, I think that there is theological development across the book, but I wouldn't say that there is theological difference. So there are a lot of theological thematic threads that go from the beginning to the end of the book that really hold it together. And so, um, the identity of Yahweh would be one of those threads. Who is this God? Who is this Yahweh? Um, and you touched briefly in your discussion with Dr. Oswald on the idea of monotheism, and is that a theological difference in Isaiah 40 to 55? Because we have these very strong statements from the divine voice of I and I alone am He. There is no other that I know. No other. All of the idols are nothing and less than nothing. And it's true that you don't have those types of really strong statements in 1 to 39. But the theology of monotheism is all there, even if on the part of the ancient Judeans, it was a kind of henotheism, right? He's one God for them, but one God among many gods. Everybody has their own gods, and we just happen to have one, a henotheism versus monotheism. But I would still say that the theology of monotheism is there, even if God's own covenant people don't really get it. And I mean, I think important also to say is, and I encounter this a lot in my North American students, where they've been raised to think that when God says that idols are false gods, it means that they're not entities at all. They don't have an existence at all. But of course, that's not the claim of Scripture. The claim of Scripture is that they're false gods because He's the only God. So their reality as spirit beings with a real existence is legitimate. But the argument again is, sure, they exist as spiritual entities, as spirit beings, but there's only one God, and I'm it. So this, of course, becomes very explicit in Isaiah 40 to 55, but I would totally agree with Dr. Oswalt that the theology of monotheism goes way, way, way back, even if God's people don't get it.
Yes, a great answer. And regarding the first part, is Yahweh guilty because he led them to Babylonians? Did they conceive him like he's the one who do everything, even good and even bad things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so coming back to 45 verse 7, I definitely wouldn't translate Ra there as evil in terms of moral evil. All of the rest of the theological weight of the Old Testament, let alone the New, affirms that God is the author of good, that he has no association with moral evil or corruption or death. And so in 45:7, I would definitely translate that as Ra as a kind of calamity. Um, yeah, calamity, difficulty, trouble. That word has very, very broad semantic range, of course. And so I do think that in the context in particular of the exile, this is one key aspect of Yahweh's argument that is quite difficult, I think, for the original audience, as well as for us today to grasp and accept. Because, of course, one of the aspects of the interpretation of the Jacob Israel servant figure that Yahweh is seeking to change is the assumption that Yahweh wasn't strong enough. Yahweh was too weak, and he ran away and abandoned them to Marduk and the Babylonians, who then poured out on them all of this undeserved evil suffering. But as an interpretation of the exile, that's not actually true. What's actually true, and this is, again, the perspective that Yahweh seeks to form in them, what's actually true is that Marduk and the Babylonians were not stronger than Yahweh. He, of his own choice, let them come in. Now, if you're an ancient Near Eastern Judean, this is not a better answer. This is not an answer that clears up your confusion. Because for an ancient Near Easterner to hear their own deity say, yeah, I left and I let them come in and destroy my chosen city and my temple. This makes no sense to an ancient Near Eastern person. So the fact that Yahweh says this does not clear up the confusion. It actually makes it more confusing for a time. And it's just sort of a wait for it moment, right? So when and then he just explicitly says, no, actually, I did that to you. I was the one who brought the Babylonians because you needed some serious discipline, because I came and I called and you didn't answer me. I sent my prophets. I tried. So let's just get this straight. Marduk and the Babylonians didn't beat me, and I didn't, in my weakness, abandon you. No. I actually brought them. They were my tool to discipline you. I'm actually the source of your current calamity. because this is just discipline. But this is again where I think memory studies is so helpful because it helps us to grasp it's so what Yahweh is doing with the audience, this exilic audience, is so complex. So he affirms that, even as he affirms that the Babylonians totally overstepped what they should have done. And in their arrogance and in their self-delusions, they had no compassion for the weak and the elderly and the poor. And Yahweh's going to judge them too. So all of these things are going on at the same time, where he's like, yeah, I did this to you, but I've got the Babylonians covered also. But in all of your suffering, I also suffered with you. So though I brought this calamity on you, I also have suffered with you in this calamity, and I'm here with you in your hidden forsakenness to bring you out of this calamity. So yes, all of this is contained within my plan, even as Yahweh distances himself from the moral evil of the Babylonians. But there is this recognition that none of this is outside of his hands. And again, for those who have suffered trauma, this is both more confusing at first, but then ultimately comforting. More confusing then it prompts this question of, so you Yahweh are the one who has shattered us? What? No wonder we don't trust you. And yet, again, the complexity of him saying, but yes, but I am with you in your suffering. I have not left you in your suffering. I'm here with you. So all of this shattering, both deserved discipline and innocent suffering, I have not left you alone in any of this. And so it's actually a remarkably audacious admission that yes, both good and calamity come from my hands. Not moral evil, but good and calamity, darkness and light. And that within my overarching plan, your trauma is actually contained and limited, which for those who have suffered trauma is essential, because the experience of trauma is an experience of being so overwhelmed by the shattering of it that it becomes the biggest totalizing reality. But Yahweh comes in, and through the poetry, there's this poetic experience. Lamentations does this too, this poetic experience of the trauma being contained and limited. And that the poetry then gives them the imagination that they don't have in their traumatized state to imagine their redemption.
Incredible. Thank you again, Dr. Megan. So, yes, some scholars would say that about monotheism, there are not clear monotheistic statements, because even Ishtar would say, I am the God and there is none beside me. So obviously in polytheistic world there are other gods. So what do you think about that explanation? Do we have any clear monotheistic statement in Isaiah, or second part at least?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a really good recognition that in our ancient Near Eastern material world context, we have other texts where the gods of the other nations make these same kinds of very, very strong claims about themselves. And so if we are listening first with ancient Near Eastern ears, we recognize that these claims that Yahweh is making sound very similar to the gods of the nations. And so I think then that the monotheistic claim comes in terms of the character of Yahweh as being radically different than the gods of the other peoples. So there is no other ancient Near Eastern deity who makes a covenant with human beings. In the ancient Near Eastern world, the idea that Yahweh pursues this small, no name, weak family to make a covenant with, well, originally Abraham, just one man and his wife, that he pursues human beings to make covenant agreements with. This is so ridiculous in the ancient Near Eastern world. Like, like so ridiculous as to just be something that you wouldn't even consider as an option. Like it's so stupid to an ancient Near Eastern mind that a god would enter into a serious covenant commitment with humans. Because, of course, in the rest of the ancient Near Eastern world, kings were special, but the rest of humans were just the god's slaves. They were just the god's minions, there to do the god's bidding, and if the gods were unhappy, it's just sort of the attitude of, well, off with their heads. We can make more if we need more. These humans are bothering me, like, get rid of them. Whereas in the Old Testament, this one God who created everything, created humans in his image. Like, like these are crazy, crazy ideas, shocking ideas in the ancient Near Eastern world. And I think it's these kinds of other aspects of God's character and identity that then set his monotheistic claims apart as truly monotheistic and not just hyperbolic propaganda rhetoric. He is a unique God in the ancient Near Eastern world. He creates out of nothing. Now, if materiality didn't have a name or a function, it meant that it was nothing. So I think anyway, that's actually a totally different topic. Sorry. But he creates out of nothing and he creates order out of chaos. But unlike other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, he doesn't have a battle with chaos in order to defeat chaos in order to create the world. So he is a deity unlike any of the other ancient Near Eastern deities. And this, then, I think, is the theological thread that makes his monotheistic claims different than what you would find in the rest of the ancient Near Eastern world.
Thank you very much for this explanation. Can I ask you, is it Hebrew on your hand?
Oh, yes.
What is the meaning?
Yes.
Like,
It says Nuchama, and it means comforted.
wow, amazing. It's really nice. So sorry about asking.
Yeah, that's
So
okay.
yeah, last question I wanted to ask. I this morning I listened to Dr. Ben Sommer, and he said that God has a body or something like that, except in Isaiah. So in Isaiah, in the second part, we have some verses that looks like God don't have a body. So what do you think about all this? Do you have some development about this idea?
Huh. Well, the short answer is I would disagree with Dr. Sommer. Really appreciate his work in Isaiah, but I would have to disagree with him on this point. Um, it's a bit difficult, of course, to know for sure what the ancient Israelites would have thought about God as a material or non-material being. We do, of course, have texts like Genesis 18:19, where three visitors come to Abraham and Sarah. And initially, they're just three visitors, but then the text just outright says that two of them are angels and one of them is the Lord. So, what do we do with that? Well, clearly, those three visitors ate food, right? It's sort of like one of Jesus's resurrection appearances and saying, "Come on, give me food to eat. I'll prove to you that I'm not a ghost." Um, But of course, we then predominantly have Yahweh manifesting his presence, not in a physical body, but in natural wonders, wind, fire, thunder, smoke, cloud. Uh, yeah, it's very interesting to think about to ask the question, what would the ancient Israelites have thought? I don't really quite know. Um, and perhaps there was then development in their understanding that we can perhaps observe in the Hebrew Bible, where the texts themselves express a growing awareness that Yahweh is spirit and does not have a physical body or physicality. So that, of course, when we encounter the anthropomorphisms of, an arm or a strong hand or the eyes of God or, things like that, that we understand them as anthropomorphisms. I wonder if there might, though, be something to be said for the anthropomorphism of, well, no, I don't think, I was going back to the creation account and thinking about God speaking and things coming into uh, order and function and form. But then, of course, in the creation story as well, we have God forming the human out of the ground. So another, what I would say is an anthropomorphism. Um, Yeah, but again, perhaps what we do have in the text is an increasing awareness on the audience's part that God is spirit and not embodied. Um, but I don't know. I don't think that the text gives us a whole lot to go on to make an argument.
Okay, Dr. Megan, that's all of my questions. So, do you have any conclusion about our discussion about Isaiah? Why Isaiah even? Can you say what is so special about that book?
Well, I liked what Dr. Oswalt said about if you had to get rid of all of the books except one, which one should you keep? I think I would have to agree that keeping Isaiah would be the best choice because it is so expansive. I have been studying the book myself now off and on, teaching it, studying it for 20 years. Of course, more specifically at different times than at others. But, I was able to teach Isaiah as an upper level elective to my undergrad students here at Prairie this past semester. And I went into the class feeling overwhelmed by the book. And I ended the class feeling more overwhelmed by the book. And then I had an opportunity to teach Isaiah for a week at a small Bible school in Sweden in May. And again, I I'm overwhelmed by the book. But I think perhaps this is one of the things that I'm coming to with the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 6, the prophet, of course, has this vision of God Seems like he's in the earthly temple, but it seems like he has a vision of the heavenly temple as well. And he is overwhelmed by this vision. And I just wonder if the massive scope and the complexity of the book is intended to give readers now something of a taste of that overwhelming vision of the Ancient One on his throne that Isaiah receives in Isaiah 6. So perhaps just a bit of encouragement to reader or to listeners who have maybe tried to read the book of Isaiah and have given up because they don't understand. It's so complex, it's so long. Maybe just a bit of encouragement to say, yeah, you're not wrong, but maybe switch your approach to the book and read it in order to be overwhelmed by the majesty and the holiness of God.
Dr. Megan, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I really learned a lot and enjoyed. So, to our listeners and viewers, if you found this conversation valuable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode. Leave a comment below with a question or something like that. So, we would love to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us on NT Podcast. And until next time, stay curious and keep asking the big questions. Goodbye.